now. So welcome to everyone. Thank you very much again for joining us, and my pleasure to introduce you tonight to Robert Bauer. Robert's 8th generation in port production. 8 generations, it's amazing. And I think absolutely fantastic, Robert, that you could join us online tonight. Tonight for us, this morning for you. And we have a fantastic tasting that you're going to take us through, including 3 very, very rare vintage ports. Fantastic. So, Robert, shall I hand it over to you?
Yes, please. Thank you. Good morning, Liz. Good evening, everybody. We've had a lot of complaints at the vineyard that we're very generous, but there's no port wine at breakfast. So finally, we're changing that. This is the breakfast of champions over here. So good evening, everybody. So I've got a picture of our Quinta de Vergeles vineyard in the background, but I'm actually in a Porto at the moment in our office, just because getting internet in the Douro, it's so remote. You will get internet, but very slow. So doing a Zoom call in the vineyards can be problematic. So it's much better in the office. Liz has set up a wonderful tasting to go through all the various styles of port wine that we have. There are a lot of books there, handbooks, that make, in my opinion, port wine quite complicated. I find it's quite a simple category. It follows a lot of the norms of table wine. And so hopefully by absorption learning that Liz is starting here, you'll become port wine experts. I'm going to do a small presentation just to give you some images, give everyone a basic level of port wine production, viticulture, some of the changes that we've made. And then we'll go into the tasting, and at which point I hope I've stimulated enough questions in everybody. And that's when I hope the chat side will go a little bit crazy. So if everyone will bear with me while I try to put on my presentation. If it doesn't work, please let Liz know. Okay, so now we have slide. Okay, there we go. Is it working for everybody?
It's working perfectly.
Okay, so the first thing to understand is port wine is not serious, should not be consumed at special occasions. It should be taken at any time to relax. So let's kick off. This map here is to not only show the region of where port wine is made in the north of Portugal, but also to bridge why all these English-speaking people are making port wine. And the reason for that is probably thanks to the French, because the English and the French had a 100-year war, and the English don't like to admit this, but the French won. And they kicked all the Brits out of Bordeaux. We had difficulty getting wine to the British population. So the only country that was open for free trade with Britain in those days was Portugal. And Portugal is Britain's oldest ally since the 1300s. And all the British merchants came down to Portugal, and there they discovered the wines of the Douro Valley, being fuller, more robust than some of the wines in the Vinho region in the north, and they started shipping these wines to the UK. The problem with these wines in the travel, it did go through secondary fermentation on the ships. The wine would oxidize slightly as well. So the wine was not arriving in the UK in wonderful conditions. So this is around 1620s to 1690s. What the British merchants did, and they didn't invent this technique. This technique existed 100 years before the British started using it for port wine, but they started adding brandy to the table wine and to fortify it, to allow it to travel to the UK, and so to arrive in condition. And this is an important point, because a lot of people think that port wine just was created by probably one of my ancestors getting plastered every evening. He probably was getting plastered, but he wasn't inventing port wine. Port wine is one of the unique wines in the world that was actually created by evolution. Over about, I would say, 70 years, every time we made the table wine sweeter, the consumer in the UK said, wow, we like this. And it evolved to the sweet wine that we have today, where half the sugar is converted into alcohol and then we fortify it. So it still has half the natural sugars of the grapes in the wine. This map also shows the area of schist, which is the rock that we plant our vines on. It's a very good rock for viticulture because it has very good drainage. It doesn't allow the grapes, so the water, to hang around the roots. So it forces the roots to go, drill down deep into the rock, and that allows the roots to bring a lot of minerality into the wines. And it's also, if you look at the rainfall, it's very close to desert conditions. So near the Atlantic Ocean, you'll have 900 milliliters of rain. If you go near the Spanish border, you only get 400, 300 milliliters of rain. This is not a good area for making table wine because of the lack of water. If you're making table wine, you probably have to irrigate, which we as a group are against for obvious reasons. For port wine, our grape varieties have evolved in the region in this hot desert conditions for many hundreds of years, and so they're able to hold up much better. If you take wine from the orange area in the map near the Spanish border, that will give you a lot of herbaceous notes, a lot of red berry fruit flavors. If you take the wines from the central region, the Cima Corgu, that will give you, because it's slightly cooler, that will give you a lot of dark berry fruit flavors, black currants, plummy wines. So the difference between Pinhão in the center and where Vergeles would be in the Cima, in the Douro Superior, you'll have a 1 degree difference in nighttime temperature, and so that does have an impact on the styles of the wine that you're gonna make there. A visual of the region, it is a mountain viticulture. So this is good and bad. It's bad in the fact that a viticulturalist has to really know his stuff, because you're going to have a lot of microclimates in a region like this. That's good for the consumer, because the more microclimates you're going to have, the more complexity you're going to have in your wine. The same grape variety will express itself differently depending where it is, whether it's the hotter vineyard closer to the river, or whether it's the cooler vineyards at the top of the mountain. So this mountain viticulture is an important aspect of the Douro. It unfortunately does cause a few extra costs, where you have to terrace everything, and a lot of these terraces are built by hand and are part of the UNESCO site, so we have to maintain them every year. But this is something that really adds complexity to the final blend. All the microclimates here also allows us to plant more grape varieties, because not every grape variety, will perform well next to the river. Too much humidity. There are grape varieties that will have a lot of difficulties with powdery mildew. So you want to try lots further up the hillside. With port wine, you have two methods of production, where you have to macerate the grapes and convert the sugar into the alcohol. You have non-vintage port, which for us uses piston fermenters, and these are robotic lagars that our winemaker David Guimarães designed when he came back from Roseworthy University, and gets 99% of the quality that we get in foot treading for our vintage port. All of our vintage ports, bar the 2020, have always been made by foot treading. Obviously, with COVID and social distancing, we haven't been able to foot tread, and so we've had a hybrid robotic system installed in the vineyards. This has its benefits, but as soon as we all get vaccinated, our objective is to go back to foot treading, because it gives you added complexity to your wine. And also, if we do go to full robotic lagars, you will probably see a change in the style of our wines. That's not necessarily bad, but you will see a change in the style of the wines. And so we want to maintain the style of our wines as much as possible. On the third day of fermentation, so you have a day and a half of treading, another day and a half where the cap rises to the surface, and then you do manual punch down for another day and a half. And then on the third day, you stop the fermentation by adding a neutral grape spirit. So never ask a 17-year-old in our vineyard for a glass of water, because invariably the joke is to give you some 77% alcohol of this grape spirit. And this grape spirit is distilled from Uni Blanc wine that we generally get from the Cognac region. So this is, I want you to remember this slide. I can come back to it in the presentation, but I want to make it really easy for everyone that port wine is all the same thing to start off with. It's all this dark, intensely fruity wine. And then it changes in the style. You can either have a fruity port or a nutty port. And it's all due to the amount of oxygen that you have in the wine. If you want to make a wine fruity, you'll put it into a large barrel. That will keep the oxygen away from the wine. You'll protect the color, you'll protect the fruit. If you want to drink a wine that's intense in flavor, drink it young. If you want something that has more complexity, drink something with a little bit more age, and I'll discuss that in the tasting. With the nutty ports, those are the aged tawnies, the single harvest tawnies. And those wines, when they're 1 year old, they are black, they are intensely fruity, they're black currants, blackberries, dark cherries, dark plums. And then over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, they lose that fruit flavor and start to pick up the dried fruits, and then these goes into the walnuts, hazelnuts, and then in the 40s, you start to get marzipan flavors, butterscotch flavors. That's all due to the effects of oxygen converting the fruity flavors to the nutty flavors. So, if you want a nutty port, you have to go for an older port. I wouldn't say that's just like my father, but sometimes there's similarities. So for vintage port, this is the only style that is 2 years in vat, just to allow the spirit and the wine to mature, to marry, and then it goes into the bottle, and then for the rest of its life, it will be maturing in the cellar. Just to clarify, this is not my cellar. I wish it was. And then this is the styles of mixing port with food. If it's chocolate, fresh fruit, go with a dark fruity port. And the nutty ports will go with anything with caramel, vanilla, or dried fruits. So now, excuse me while I have to get out of the slide. Is everyone there? Oops, no. Excuse me again. It's right. Perfect. Is everyone there?
Yes, we've got you. This
okay,
is Robert's first time using their new IT setup. You're doing very well.
Yeah, well, it's that's because no one's come into the office yet and started using the internet. So, but I think that was a very, very quick presentation on port wine, because I know it's late for everyone. I don't really want to bore anyone with a PowerPoint presentation, but I think that's the best way to think of port wine is it's fruity, it's nutty. If you're drinking, I mean, the Ruby Tawny White is we call the entry level of port wine, and that's your 2 to 3 year old wine. That represents probably about 80% of port production. And although we do very well in New Zealand with this category, that is not where we specialize. There are many producers that are much more powerful in that category, where we as a group, Taylors and Fonseca, focus is much more on the quality end, and that will be in reserves, late bottle vintage, 10, 20, 30, and vintage port, and that's the 20%. And I think that's why it's much better for a tasting this evening that we focus on the good stuff. Now, are there any hands? Does anybody want to try some port wine? Good, good. Got some thumbs up. There we go. Okay. So let's start with the first wine. So this is the Taylor's Chip Dry White Port, and for those of you who haven't seen the bottle, that's it's over there. The Taylor's Chip Dry, it's all made from Portuguese grape varietals, predominantly Malvasia Fina, Guvinho, and Ribagato. This is a wine that was created because we did have a little bit of an issue getting sherry from Spain, our neighbor. And Dick Yateman got very fed up of not getting his sherry, that he decided to make his own. So he said, well, I have white grape varieties. I have a winery. So why don't I make my own aperitif? And so what he did was he put these grapes in the lagar. He fermented the wines for a little bit longer, so it's drier, and he fortified it in the normal way you'd fortify any port wine. And this is designed to cleanse the palate, so it's drier than a normal port, and it's designed to be refreshing as well. It can be 40 degrees, 45 degrees in the vineyards in the summer. You don't want something with a lot of residual sugar. So this was designed as aperitif. On the nose, you get a little of this sort of almost biscuity flavor, a lot of, I would say, sort of apple notes, a little bit of citrus flavors. And very, very good structure and tannins here. Now, it's not right or wrong. Our style, we could make this very fragrant and fresh. We could do that by just making the wine younger, which would make our CFO much happier, but we try not to keep him too happy. And this is a wine that's actually matured in barrel for 2 years. So it does pick up more secondary flavors in the glass. This is something also that if you're having, if you're having this just before dinner to cleanse the palate, it's absolutely fantastic. But it is 20% alcohol straight. And if you're having this as an aperitif, then you're having your white wine, your red wine, and your port wine. You may find that you have a great singing ability. Now, I'm not saying you don't have singing ability, but many of my family don't. So if it's 5 o'clock on a Saturday, what we will do is we'll do a chip tea and tonic, or a port tonic. And so we'll just get a tall glass, fill it with ice, put in a lemon or some mint leaves in there, fill the glass half with chip dry, and then put a little bit of tonic water. And that's a very, very refreshing drink. It lowers the alcohol of the chip dry, and it keeps family members from thinking that they're opera singers halfway through the meal. So this is a category at the moment that is really growing. We created the first dry white in 1934 or 32. It's hard to remember. So we've been talking about this for a very long time. But it's really been in the last 5 years. We've seen it grow in the US, we've seen it grow in New Zealand, we've seen it grow in Eastern Europe, Russia, and also in the UK and Portugal. So there's been a huge amount of excitement in chip dry, especially with the port tonic as well. So is everyone like it?
Yeah, it's very good. I think the tonic water that we like using with this, Robert, is East Imperial,
Yes.
which you can see Richard's holding you up an example of there,
Yeah.
which is a really good match with it. Tell me.
Yeah, I was very lucky to try it. I had some bottles sent over, and it really worked very well with this white port.
Yeah. What is, sorry, technical question for you. What is the residual sugar?
It can change. It's around 3.9 grams per litre.
Okay.
So there is some sugar there, but it's where a normal port wine is around 93 grams. And if you're going up to something from the 1800s, it could go up to around 140, 145 grams per litre. But if it was made just after Waterloo, you can expect a little bit of evaporation, and that will increase the sugar content.
Yes.
You disappeared there.
Sorry. Yes, back again. Okay. No, that's a lot drier than.
Sorry. No, it's 39 grams per litre. Sorry, not 3.9.
Thank you. I was thinking that's a little bit too dry, but no, it's still dry, isn't it? And it's lovely.
Yeah.
Gosh, it goes very well with the tonic.
Now, if you are using a basic white, they tend to be sweet, and it's personal taste. But I think a lot of tonic waters, I wouldn't say the Imperial has it, but more of the commercial tonic waters have a lot of sugar. So if you're using a basic white with a basic tonic water with more sugar on top of more sugar, you've really got to find something, a lot of lemon, some acidity that's going to break up all of that sugar, or just go for the chip dry where it's much drier, and then it'll be perfectly refreshing. And we do a Fonseca one. The Fonseca one has a little bit more. It's a little bit more formal, a little bit more citrusy than the Taylor's chip dry. It doesn't have that biscuity flavor to it. And that one's called Sirocco. And the reason we call that, because it's named after the dry winds that we get from Africa. Cool. And also our winemaker's father was stationed in Africa during his military service. So I think that's probably why he thought of that name.
Very cool. Always lovely to hear the stories behind the names.
There are a lot of stories in our family. Some cannot be recorded.
Excellent.
So should we go into the next style? Now, all of the first three wines and the second flight, they're all fruity wines. So, the white port is still fruity. It's just citrus fruit. Now we're going into the next two, which is the Taylor's First Estate Reserve, and then you're going into the Taylor's Late Bottle Vintage. Okay. Now, what I suggest is you pick up your Reserve in your left hand and your LBV in your right hand. Now, the reason being is, I think for this one, it's very important to see the difference in styles. You'll get people in the trade who've been drinking a lot of wine, most people. They will try and force people to have a late bottle vintage because it has more complexity. When you've been drinking a lot of wine, something just with power and a very narrow flavor profile tends to come across as quite boring. And normally when you start drinking, you tend to go for intensity of fruit. But the trade, they've been drinking wine for so long, they tend to gravitate towards LBV. That doesn't mean it's better. It just means that's what they prefer. So don't let me tell you what is better, what you should drink. You should choose what you prefer. So if you like wines with a lot of intensity, go for the Taylor's First Estate Reserve. So this is a 3 to 4 year old port that spent that time in those large wooden vats. And so it's still got a lot of that sort of dark blackcurrant and blackberry flavor. Swirling around the palate. Do all of you get that very tannic grip on your tongue? Very angular. And that is something that we as a producer have to maintain, because that's the house style. Taylor's house style does give you that very angular grip, which is very different to the Fonseca brand, which will be much rounder on the mid palate. Now, other producers are more intelligent than us. We're very simple lot. So we're not intelligent enough to do one thing from one house and one thing for the other. So Taylor's and Fonseca are made exactly the safe way, because we don't know how to tread one way for Taylor's and tread another way for Fonseca. The only difference that comes out is the vineyards are positioned in different places, and there is some blending that goes on with the varietals. But Taylor's will be angular and a little bit more red berry fruits, more herbaceous, where Fonseca will be much more black currants and blackberries, round and voluptuous. My mother would used to say, think of Taylor's as Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady, that wonderful pose, and think of Fonseca as Marilyn Monroe, sort of round, vivacious, bubbly. They're very different styles. The quality, we don't control the quality, the vineyards do that. But they definitely have two different styles. So if you don't prefer that angular tannic grip of Taylor's, you may prefer the roundness and the dark fruit of Fonseca, and that's a discovery you'll all have to make at home. Isn't wine fun? So if you try the Taylor's First Estate, it's got that sort of like that strawberries, that raspberries. The angular taste, but it lasts on the palate a good minute and a half. And that is something you didn't always used to have, because previously we used to use pump over, remontage, to make our port wines. If I go further back, when we didn't have electricity in the Douro, so we only had electricity in the Douro at the end of the 70s. So anything made probably actually when my father started in 59, that was all made without electricity, and you use auto-vinifiers. Auto-vinifiers is a wonderful technology which basically uses the pressure of fermentation to push the grapes around, to macerate the grapes. But the problem with the auto-vinifier is you will seal it and nothing will happen for a day and a half, because you need the fermentation to create the movement of the grapes. And fermentation only happens after a day and a half. And then after a day and a half of fermentation, half your sugar has been converted into alcohol. And then you have to stop the fermentation. So the auto-vinifier for a non-vintage port only got 40% of the quality that we're having today. When we had electricity, we thought, wonderful, we can now steal this technology from France, the electrical pump, and now we'll make non-vintage port as good as vintage port. Unfortunately, the electrical pump is too aggressive for port wine. It's designed for a week and a half, 2 week fermentation. So if you over pump your port, you get a wine that is too tannic, too aggressive. So anything that the best you could do is about 60% of the quality of vintage port. And so, you know, our first estate, LBV, until 2004 was only 60% of the quality of vintage port. Now, we're never happy producing that quality, but there was no technology other than the human foot designed for a 3-day fermentation process. So when David came back from Roseworthy and he had seen pistons being used in Australia, he took the board of directors out for a couple of bottles of vintage port and then asked for a lot of money. He got it. So the trick of asking for money is vintage port first, then ask for money afterwards. And he basically did, it was about 10 years of R&D with different fermenter sizes, heights, and came up with those piston fermenters that you saw in my presentation. And that will get 99% of the phenolics and anthocyanins we're getting in foot treading, we're getting into our non-vintage port. So what's that mean is this first estate used to be, wasn't as fresh, wasn't as lively. It was a little bit tired, and it didn't last in the palate as long. That was not our fault, that was pump over. When we use piston fermenters, it now lasts much, much longer on the palate. It's much more vibrant. Yes, the technology costs a little bit more, but I think the returns you get on quality justify the investment. So this is the change that has happened. We built the winery in 2001. So after 3 years of maturing, first estate in 2004 started to have this technology. Now, so if you try the first estate and then go to the late bottle vintage, you will see that you get a little bit more complexity, both on the nose and on the palate. So this is the late bottle vintage 14. Much more breadth of flavor on this one. Now I want you just to leave it a few seconds and now go back to the first estate. So you can see the difference between complexity and intensity. Both are wonderful. I actually drink both. If it's a very intense chocolate dessert, I will do a first estate. The tannins and acidity break up the long chain sugar molecules of the chocolate dessert, so I can eat more chocolate. I always find a way to do that. And then if there's a chocolate dessert with a little bit more flavors on it, some strawberries and plums on there, you need more complexity to go with that dessert, then I'll have a late bottle vintage. To speak about the names, the Taylor's First Estate is named because our founder, Job Beersley, he founded the first British port house in 1692. Now, he was trading in Porto, in the north of Portugal in 1622, but he moved down to Porto and founded Taylor's in 1692 in our lodge there. And then he was buying all the wines as they came down the Douro Valley, and he was finding huge inconsistency in the quality that was coming downriver. And so we were the first family that went up to the Douro and actually bought vineyards to control the quality. So in 1744, we bought the first estate in the Douro Valley. And so that's where this name comes from, First Estate. The late bottle vintage, this was created, well, a lot of people forgot to bottle their vintage after the 2 years. That's not saying they invented late bottle vintage, they forgot to bottle their vintage on time, I would say. What we did here, or my father and Alistair Robertson did, is you've got to remember the port trade was in the doldrums in the 60s and 70s, primarily because a lot of our consumers are being killed by 2 world wars, the impacts of these nasty occurrences. And so the trade in the UK wanted a wine that had some of the complexities of a 12-year-old vintage port, but didn't want to have to decant it, and wanted it to be stable once open for 4 to 8 weeks. And so what my father and Alistair did is that instead of bottling their vintage at 2 years old, they kept it in the vat for 6 years. And by keeping the wine in a vat, it will mature faster. And so you have a wine with a complexity of similar to a 12-year-old vintage port. It's had more contact with oxygen that a vintage port has had. So that has stabilized it. So you can keep it open longer. And then also it's spent several years in the vat. So a lot of the particulates have fallen out. So it doesn't need decanting. Now you can do an unfiltered LBV. I still haven't had to filter an unfiltered LBV. A lot of the particulates have fallen out of an unfiltered LBV, but we do clarify. We do clarify this wine, so it's nice and sparkly for you. So it certainly does not need decanting. A late bottle vintage is not designed to cellar. We've made it so it's ready to drink. So it's fine for about 10 years in your cellar, but what's the point of aging an LBV? It's not going to age so gracefully as a vintage port. So my suggestion is, you can buy cases of vintage from Liz and put it in your cellar, but with non-vintage port, I would go in there and buy the bottle, and when you need another one, go back and replenish your stocks. So that's where the late bottle vintage comes from. And this is actually where we're seeing the most amount of growth, because the consumer of 50 years ago is very different to the consumer today, because we have people like Liz doing these educational courses. We have wine magazines that we never used to have 50 years ago. We have West End educators around. The consumer is becoming much more knowledgeable about wine. Consumers becoming more interested in complexity of flavors. If you look at a supermarket 40 years ago and what's in a supermarket today in foods for home cooking, people are creating, even in their home when you're cooking, much more complex dishes than they were 40 years ago. And so this is where we're seeing late bottle vintage become much more interesting. And I think in New Zealand it's going to go that way as well. I think we need to do more of these events, but I find the New Zealand population, when it comes to wine, is much more educated than many countries around the world.
Yeah,
so does anyone have any questions on the first 3 wines?
We've had some lovely comments here on them. I think just important general, I think we used to actually drink a lot more port here. In fact, I know we used to, but we had a silly tax put on port, which was, it's reasonably interesting. It was a mistake by one of our governments trying to tax a particular level of cheap spirit that was appearing in the market. And I remember I was working in our retail stores at the time, and some locally made fortified wine went from $9.99 on the shelf to $20 overnight with this new tax. And it hit locally made fortified wine, but unfortunately hit the port market as well. And at the time we thought that there would be very little future for port wine in New Zealand, yet we've been very surprised. And I think it is, as you say, just how educated the New Zealand market is, particularly with these styles of wines, which is great.
Yeah, and I think also, the qualities of port wine have grown, both in what's available in New Zealand, but around the world. But port is a very resilient category. You know, it's not as alcoholic as a whiskey, as a cognac or a Calvados. It's got a lot of complexity there. And it's a wonderful comfort drink that, you know, people don't give up. I mean, I was in New York working for our importer there when Lehman Brothers failed. And it was interesting that, you know, everyone gave up the champagnes and their iconic wines, but the thing they didn't give up was their glass of port at home. So it's which is good and bad. We're not going to get a huge increase in the curve. Will never be, you know, logarithmic in our growth as a business. We get slow, steady growth, and actually that's what we prefer, because we can't react as fast as a table wine producer can, because, you know, the average age of our wine is 6 years old. So, you know, we like steady growth. Port wine is where it is suffering is actually in the Ruby Tawny white, because we're seeing people drink less but better quality. And so if you look at the basic level, that is falling. What is growing is the quality end, and that's generally across the world.
I think it's why it's important, Robert, as we saw tonight with the white, is to drink them in different occasions, because I think we sort of forget that port can be an aperitif, and, you know, with such an interest in cocktails and different ways of drinking things, I think there's a really great market there for port.
Yes, I mean, we've always, since I can't tell you how young I've been drinking white port and tonic, but it's been a while. But, you know, whenever we're on the vineyards, you know, with me and my brothers and my parents, you know, this is the perfect thing. You do a walk around the vineyard, it's boiling hot, you know, and then have this to sort of refresh you. It's absolutely idyllic. But, you know, we're also seeing from the US, as well as the fortified cocktails, where they also want to reduce their alcohol content in their cocktails, and so they're using a lot of fortified wines. And so we just opened up the World of Wine in August this year in Gaia, and in our Angel Share wine bar, I did get to choose a lot of or taste a lot of their fortified wine cocktails. And I'm a little bit old-fashioned, so I was a bit skeptical, but I have to say, you know, they are very, very good. And talking to the barman, he said that actually fortified cocktails are very good, because port wines have so much intensity and complexity. They add another dimension to the cocktail that many other ingredients can't do. So, you know, I couldn't complain too much. It was a very good cocktail.
Excellent. Robert, we've just got a question come through. In terms of the global markets, the market that you're seeing the most growth in, or perhaps up until end of last year, let's just forget 2020.
Yeah, well, you know, it's sort of the markets we're seeing the most growth in would be probably the United States. And that's, you know, an uphill struggle, because there you have very few distributors, very powerful distributors. And so getting your share of voice is very difficult. But every year it's been growing considerably. But it's been growing, you know, in Russia, Eastern Europe, it's been doing very, very well. And New Zealand's doing very well as well in the quality end. The UK is a traditional market. Actually, this year we're seeing absolutely incredible growth, because everyone's at home with a glass of port. So, you know, port wine sales in a crisis tend to do well. If you're going to be stuck at home, you know, and you've got a good book, a glass of port really does the trick. Yeah, I'd say the US, I'd say, is the fastest growing, and then I would say probably the UK after that.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
But that could be a challenge to New Zealand.
Wow. I think we'll just keep growing in the quality stake. That's a good place to be growing, isn't it?
No, it's the only way to go.
Yeah. Excellent.
Okay, do you have any more questions on the last flight?
Most of the comments coming through, well, all of them have just been on what an exquisite way to start and how great the ports are. So excellent timing, I think, to go to what's going to be a sensational flight too.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I love vintage port. I love vintage port so much that traditionally as an industry, we always say vintage port and blue vein cheeses. I actually encourage my brothers to have cheese so I can have more vintage port. So it's you know, vintage port is something that we tend to put off to a very special occasion, but then, you know, you keep putting it off, and you never end up drinking vintage port. And the Financial Times put it, the only traditional wine region in the world, Grand Cru wine region in the world, that you can classify as a buy is actually vintage port. It's completely undervalued. So, you know, this is, I think, what the popularity of vintage is still growing because people do see a lot of value in vintage port. You can drink these wines young now. You couldn't drink the 94 young. The reason being is there have been huge changes in the quality of the grape spirit. So previously we had to buy the grape spirit from the Portuguese government, and for the Wessex course members, they can all tell me when the law changed. No one responded. So
I'm sure we'll get some.
Yeah, so we had a very dictatorial regulator here, and so they basically forced all port producers to buy the grape spirit from them. And therefore, their opinion was they were making the spirit side more democratic. However, you've got volume producers and quality producers all buying the same stuff. And when you're buying in 50 million gallon lots, there's not much quality there. And actually, David came back from Australia, and he basically said, right, we're gonna deal with this issue. And in 91, we took the responsibility of purchasing the grape spirit from the Portuguese government. We threatened to take them to the European courts to say it's unfair monopoly. Unfortunately, they gave way beforehand. And then from 91, we started to source our own grape spirit. Now, when we went to France to get our grape spirit, David said, this is the grape spirit that I want, because he did his thesis on that in Australia. And the distillers said, great, but we don't have that spirit available. And it took 8 years for us to get the spirit that we wanted for fortification. So 94 is a beautiful, beautiful wine. A lot of complexity in the wine. You know, got that lovely chestnut color, dark brick terracotta center. But this wine has a spirit that to us isn't quite up to snuff. You know, the 77 got 100 points, but that spirit came from the government. If that spirit came from what we're using today, it would be mind-blowing. So it's not, the 77 is a delicious wine. If no one wants their 77, I'll take it. But, you know, this is just saying, this is so amazing now, and it's being held back by 1/5 of the spirit. If you try the 16, this 16 will knock the socks off the 94 when it's the same age, just because we're using better spirit, and there's a little bit of an increased know-how. So you get a lot of, I find, sort of like strawberry jam on the nose, a little bit of, a lot of sort of plum jam as well.
So Robert, the first year that you used the different spirit was then 97, was it?
No, every year we're using different spirit.
No,
but
in
it
terms
was
of the
not
change from the government one.
91. Well, 91, we as an industry
Okay.
took over the purchase, but it's still in a large volume.
Mm-hmm.
So from that point, now we've taken over, control of the car. We could, guide the direction, or put the brakes on and get off the car, get out of the car. So it was 98. David was very happy with the 98 spirit, but he said 2000 was when he was satisfied with the quality of the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we use small batch spirits that are neutral in flavor. So you don't want the flavor altering the port wine that you're going to make. And it has very good structure to it as well. So it's all about the aldehyde makeup. And if you get the right aldehyde makeup in your spirit, it will bind to your wine faster. So when you drank a 94 in 96, it'll probably, burn your nose. I mean, you could feel the heat on top of the fruit. Now, when you try a 2016, just after it's made, you don't get that heat. And, a lot of, consumers and even journalists said, oh, you're reducing the alcohol in your wine. So no, it's still 20%. It's just we're using better quality spirit, and that marries with the wine better.
Very interesting.
Yeah, but this by itself, and this with a blue vein cheese, this will lubricate good conversation. And I think this is the other thing that the mistake that we make is that you tend to open probably one bottle of red too many when you have friends around. This is something you really want to bring the port wine as soon as the main course is finished. You want to put the bottle of port, the decanter on the table, while you're taking the plates away and putting them in the kitchen, getting dessert ready. Your guests are enjoying their vintage port, and you'll certainly notice the conversation certainly improves when people return. Now, obviously, with COVID and restrictions of people having gatherings, vintage port, is a little bit difficult. So you may not do it in 2 hours. It may just take you 4 hours to polish off the vintage port. Also, another opportunity is half bottles. Half bottles are delicious. They will mature faster. So if you have a 94, it will probably taste like an 85. But 85s are absolutely delicious. Half bottles really become a problem when you're buying a half bottle of 1963 or 1977. But when you're drinking a half bottle of a 94, 97, a 2000, they're absolutely delicious. And two people in an evening by themselves should be able to polish off a half bottle of a good vintage port. Liz, I do have to point out the 94s do need decanting, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page there. After 10. Yeah, go ahead.
We actually, interesting, when we prepared the samples, we did find with the 94 that we lost quite a bit at the bottom of each bottle, and because of the way we're doing it, even with these wines, for those who've been to a few of our tastings and know that we're preparing the samples in the absence of air, the ports probably would have been okay given it's a short window without doing that, but we have done that to give you just the most pristine samples. And yeah, we certainly had some sediment, Robert.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a sign of a good wine, a good full-bodied wine. So the 97, the 94s will have big clumps. The 94s are actually quite easy to filter. The 2007, so when a port is around 10 years old, it will pick up a lot of small particulates, and they're actually the hardest to filter. You really have to get some cheesecloth and double it over a few times. And because you don't want those small particulates hitting your tongue and changing the flavors that you're going to get. I mean, they do alter the flavor of the wine. So decanting after 10 years of the vintage date on the bottle, I think is very, very important. So, I mean, you can get very good filters in the market. I would not use an aerator on your vintage port, because that's too aggressive for an old vintage port and could damage the wine. So try and get something with a funnel with a very sort of basically a nice smooth finish to it. Cheesecloth that's not been bleached is the best way. I have been in Siberia, where I have had to pop into the hospital to get some gauze to filter some vintage port. So medical gauze, you know, you have to adapt to any situation. There have been cases where somebody has used his wife's tights. Fine, whatever you use, just make sure you get permission, because they're not going to be used again. So you will have to throw those away. But, you know, filtering a vintage port is very important. Normally let it stand for probably, bring it out in the morning, let it stand over the day, and then filter it in the evening. It's do it slowly. It's actually very, very easy to do. Now let's go to the next wine. So we have the 2007. You notice it's much darker. So if you can, I should have said this beforehand, if you can find a white surface, try and memorize the color, because this is what we do every Wednesday. We have the British port shippers get together. We're actually very good friends, which is good because most of them are my cousins. But you basically get a blind vintage port that could have been produced by anybody. And so memorizing the color allows you to work out whether it's older or younger than the last wine you had. So if you memorize this 94, I mean, this 94 is quite consistent with the 94s there. So if you look at this color and you find something that's lighter, you would say it's probably, it could be a 92, it could be an 85. And then you look at it, well, I had an 80 2 weeks ago, and so it's got to be, and it's darker than the 80s. So then you'd say, oh, it's probably sort of an 85. So memorizing the color is very important. So if you look at the colors of the 2007, the 2016, look at those rings and try and memorize them. And that will give you very good markers, so that when you're looking at a port wine, you can kind of get a rough idea of the age of the vintage. You know, when you look at the 2016, you're getting a lot of very dark in the center. Sometimes you get a little bit of a purpley note, that would be something very just on release. This has still got that dark brick red rim to it. It's starting to brown a little bit on the 2007 as it's getting some age. So those are important. It's an important thing to do, is to look at the color of your vintage port to help you guess the vintage. And then try the 07 on the nose with the 16, so you can see how the wines develop. And then do 17, 2007, and 2000, and then 94. So go up and down on the nose, assuming you haven't polished off the 94 already. So you see the 2016 has a lot of very normal, I would say, red wine, young red wine characteristics. Still got a lot of that primary fruit. But wow, what a lot of weight that 2016 has. Big, round, a lot of tannins there. Very, very concentrated. Now, vintage port is not made every year. It's only made on special occasions. We don't believe it's your job to learn a vintage chart. You got more important things to do. So when the quality, the weather in the Douro Valley is exceptional, that is the time that we will try the wine, we'll find the wine's exceptional, and we will create a classic vintage port. That is us telling you that this was an exceptional year. If it wasn't an exceptional year, maybe a little bit cooler, you could make a single vineyard vintage port. Quinta de Vergeles, Quinta Terra Feita, Fonseca, Panoscal, Guimarães, those are the single Quinta vintage ports. Slightly early maturing, so we also lower the price on those as well. But if it's a truly terrible wine, we won't make it. And so I think this is the big difference. For the historians, I believe that I think the first use of vintage on a bottle was for port wine, and it was Chateau Lafite who 12 years after the first use in port started to put it on every year, and kind of destroyed the whole concept of putting vintage on only exceptional wines. I'm quoting Sarah Bradford's book, but she did do some research on that. So vintage comes from port wine. It's to say this was exceptional. We don't make a bad vintage, because if it's a bad year, we don't make it. It's as simple as that. It is also a blend of vineyards. So we're all about complexity. Think of table wine trying to be the world's top solo artist, a Pavarotti. They're looking for that wonderful pure note, that pure expression of terroir. And solo artists have a lot of demands. If that note wobbles in any way, the critics attack them. For port wine, we're not looking for purity. We should be judged on complexity. So think of us as a philharmonic orchestra. Now, an orchestra can be an oboe, a violin, a cello. That will give you, some complexity, but you'll never win an orchestral competition when you're against a philharmonic orchestra, because you want, the varietals are your instruments, your musician, your music is your winemaker. Viticulturalist is the teacher that got the musicians into international level, and the blender is your conductor that brings everything into focus and harmony. And this is the big difference, is that we want to have all of our vineyards blended together. Because if you get, for tailors, if you get Quinta de Vergeles near the Spanish border with those lovely herbaceous notes, eucalyptus notes, a little bit of touch of cedar, and blend that in with the plumminess of Terra Feita, you're going to get a more complex wine. So on a classic vintage, and these are 3 classic vintages, they're a blend of 3 vineyards to get more complexity. When the weather is not great everywhere, you will make a vintage port from only the vineyards that had an exceptional microclimate. And if it was terrible everywhere, you just don't make a vintage port. So the difference also between the 94 and the 2007, the 16, is what were the stress factors that caused concentration in the wine. In 94, it was a very hot year in the Douro Valley, but you didn't get excessive heat peaks, but you definitely got some heat and dryness during the growing season, and so that helped concentrate the wine. In 94, we had a lot of hot air, so Touriga Francesa actually had a few problems. You had a little bit less Touriga Francesa in 94s across the region. However, in 2007, it was Tinta Barocca that actually did much better. So this also creates the difference in the years, as you will find certain varietals do better in different years. So over here in 94, here I would say a major impact of this would probably the Touriga Nacional, the Tinta Rige. Tinta Barocca has an impact, but it has more of an impact in Fonseca wines. The 2007, here we had Tinta Barocca, a lot of Tinto Cão coming into here. We have also Tinta Rige, we have Tinta Amarela, we have also Touriga Francesa. So all of these grape varietals will add different elements to the final blend. Touriga Nacional is probably the most famous. The Portuguese wine bodies love to promote Touriga Nacional. But Touriga Nacional, in my opinion, is rather a boring grape varietal by itself. It's got a lot of color to the wine. It's got some fruit, but by itself, it's rather dull. I prefer adding that with, and that's with a table wine as well. If you add that with some Touriga Francesa, which can give you a lot of floral notes, very aromatic. Add that with Tinta Barroca, also quite aromatic, very round and voluptuous. Tinto Cão is called the red dog because it has a lot of acidity to the wine, a lot of red berry fruit flavors. That's very important. That acidity is very important in vintage port. You can add a Tinta Roriz, which is a relative to Tempranillo. That will give it a lot of firm tannins. It can also add a lot of nice red berry fruit flavors depending where you plant it. So there's all of these varieties by themselves are interesting, but together they make a much more interesting wine. And so and the blending is so important. And people forget the impact that the blending does. And I would say, you know, the vineyards create the image that's a little bit out of focus, and the blender just brings that whole thing into focus, into the house style. One of the major differences between the 94 as well as the 2016 is the impact of batch fermentation and co-fermentation. So previous generations used to basically plant their vineyards in a mix mash of varietals. Now, we always thought it was our grandparents who were a little bit nutty. They just, you know, found a vine would die and they would just put in another varietal in there, and there was no rhyme or reason to it. And what we've discovered is actually there was some method to the madness, is that they found when they had terraces that had several varietals in there and they were co-fermenting those varietals, they were making more expressive wines, because some varietals won't have as many tannins as another. So you can use the tannins of one grape varietal to help fix some of the flavors and aromatics of another varietal. So co-fermentation is something that, you know, they were doing back in the day. What then happened was the next generation, you know, came along and they looked at their parents and they said, look, why are you doing this? You really need to plant Tinta Barroca, for example, in places where Tinta Barroca will perform better, because Tinta Barroca is a varietal that will mature early during harvest. It has a lot of vigor, which means it'll put a lot of effort into foliage, which you don't want. What you want to do is plant it in unfertile parts of your vineyard to control that vigor. And so, you know, they started to batch plant their vines around their vineyards. And so this was happening around sort of the 60s, 70s, they started doing that. These things don't happen fast, because you only replant your vineyard when it's ready to replant. So this can happen over, you know, a space of 30 years. But it's really that David discovered that, especially after we bought another brand that had a lot of old vineyards, he understood co-fermentation being very important. And so we've been replanting all of our vineyards as we have to do this, so that our vineyards are designed for co-fermentation. So grape varieties will mature at the same time. And granted, it gives the viticulturalists a headache, and it makes harvests very complicated, but you do make much more expressive, complex wines by doing this. So give you an example, again, back to Tinta Barroca. Tinta Barroca has a lot of tannins, so it's very important in co-fermentation. Now, if you want to do co-fermentation with Tinta Barroca, you have to plant it differently because it's early maturing. So you'll have Tinta Barroca in the beginning of harvest, but how do you get it at the end of harvest? The advantage we have being a mountain viticulture, we can find an unfertile part of our vineyard at the top of the vineyard where it's cooler, maybe slightly north facing to retard the maturation. And so then you can get Tinta Barocca throughout harvest. So this is the advantages of mountain viticulture. We can do this, but it does make things more complicated. And we're doing the replanting, continuously. As vineyards get to the limit of their age, we'll redo sections of vineyards so they're ready for co-fermentation.
Thank you, Robert. Fascinating. We've got a question here. You made a comment on herbaceous flavours close to the Spanish border. Is that due to altitude or is it due to the heat?
It's more due to the heat.
Okay.
Altitude, it is slightly higher, but no, it's very much due to the heat. I mean, it can get very, very hot in the Cima Corvo, especially in this year. We have actually our production director on our bottling line. She's actually one of our suppliers as well. And she was seeing some vineyards that had all of their grapes literally shriveled this year because of the heat that you get in the Douro Superior. The advantage of Quinta Vergelas, it's not south facing, it's northwest facing. So we get the hillside creates a wonderful shadow around 3-4 o'clock, and that helps cool the vineyard. So there is a difference of 1 degree between Cima Corvo and Vergelas. There is a 0.6 degree Celsius difference with every 100 meters you go up in altitude. So you could have about a 1.2 to 1.4 degree difference in temperature between the river and the top of your vineyard, depending how tall your vineyard is. So there's a lot of variation that you can get. I think actually that's also what winemakers love. They like, having a flat, vineyard that's all the same. I imagine for a viticulturalist and a winemaker is rather boring. It makes production very easy, but winemakers, they love to experiment. And so with a mountain viticulture, I think winemakers have a lot of fun.
Excellent, thank you. 3 fantastic vintage ports, and what a unique opportunity to be able to try and see, some clear evolution from one showing beautiful age, one halfway there, and then one very youthful port. Was excellent. Thank you.
But I think the 2007, is a lot of the old school would say you have to wait 20 years, but that they're thinking with the old style of spirit, because you needed 20 years for the spirit and the wine to come together. I think the 2007 is absolutely delicious now. And I think what we try to tell people is with vintage port, if you want the 16, you love that intensity of fruit flavor, drink it. Don't let anyone tell you you have to wait for your vintage port. If you like that freshness of fruit, drink it. But try not to drink it all. And this is why you always buy cases of vintage port. You also buy cases of any good wine that's going to be out of stock, is that you want to see it evolve. And so with vintage port, it will evolve every 5 years. It's probably going to be a different wine. So you want to go back to your vintages every 5 years. I would say with a great table wine that has aging potential, I would say that's every 2 years. You want to go back and revisit that wine. And it's fascinating when you look back at your notes and you say, wow, I don't get any of this flavor, but I'm now starting to get more spices in the wine. So, with vintage port, they evolve like children, so sometimes they get a little bit teenagery on you. But, eventually when they all leave home, there's a lot of happiness there, off they go.
We've got some questions and comments here for you, Robert. So first of all, the 2007 is delicious, really well integrated spirit and nice complexity, and really starting to show well. Another comment that the 2007 was also the pick of the wines, which is really, really interesting. The next question was, is port popular with the Portuguese?
Yes and no. With some it is, but to be honest, the fact that we have every port producer here, you've got the 80% here, so there is a lot of different quality, would I say, available, and that makes it quite difficult. Where with the export market, most of the bad stuff stays in Portugal. You tend to find a category is grown by quality retailers, quality wines, and that creates a category. In Portugal, it's kind of like, if you live in London, you never go and visit the Tower of London because it's always tomorrow. In Portugal, in the last 10 years, it has been growing, but historically it hasn't, because they've always drunk or been offered the low end, and no one's offered them, the good stuff that was always exported. It's not too dissimilar to Bordeaux. If you go to Bordeaux, you expect to be drinking great wine, and most of the stuff you get in Bordeaux is Vin de Table and very basic. I'd say 93% of the good Bordeaux's are exported. Probably 1% stays in Bordeaux, and the rest is in Paris. So it's not too dissimilar. And the Portuguese do have they don't respect a lot of their own products, whether it's port, textiles. The Portuguese textiles are absolutely amazing. Yeah, they're still not really buying their own products. But that's a generational thing. That would be my father's generation. The younger generation, half of them are taking pride in their own products. And I think in another 20 years, that will increase even further. So as the generations change. So, that's, as you see the generations change, we're seeing port consumption increase here in Portugal. But,
Excellent.
if you look at the statistics, it's really tourism.
Yeah, okay, which there's less and less of at the moment. Question, the 94 vintage, something you've tried recently, and when will that be at its best, was what the question was.
No, it's a good question. I mean, the 94 I had 8 years ago, and it wasn't great. It was definitely in its teenage phase. And it opened up about 4 years ago. I think it still can evolve a little bit more. So I'll give it another 10 years. But when I say 10 years, it kind of reaches a plateau. So you can drink it another 2 times, it's going to be a very different wine. And then once it reaches its plateau, it doesn't really change that much. It doesn't really sort of, have a peak where it just falls off with some table wines. It'll hold its own. The reason I said this was a funky, this is the problem with the spirit going through this marriage stage. When it's doing that, it's not a pleasant wine. It kind of shuts down. It's not really that interesting. Since we've been using the higher quality spirit, with the 2007s, the 2003s, we're not going through this funky teenage phase, because the wine is already married with the spirit. So, the 94 is a bit different to the other two. It's a delicious wine, but it's just come out of that sort of that teenage phase, and it's now evolving a little bit better. So, I mean, I've been fortunate to have it a few times at the factory house, ours and a few of our competitors, and they're drinking very, very well. But they've been improving steadily with each year. So it's drinking delicious now. I'd drink it again in another 5 years' time, and 5 years after that.
Excellent. Okay, we've got lots of comments there that loved it and feels like it's got another decade or 3 to go.
Yeah, and I will say, for some reason, vintage port does taste better when it's out of somebody else's cellar.
Always. It's like any great bottle.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I think, opportunity for this. What we also do here in Portugal, a little bit in the UK, is we also give it as wedding presents. also to godchildren, so they can have it when they're 21, because there are very few wines you can give to a godchild or my child, and you'll find that not only can they drink it when they're 21, they can also sell it to pay off university, but they will remember their godfather when they're 21. They will remember it if, at their wedding. They'll drink it when they have their first child. Their first child could drink it, and every time raise a glass to the godfather who gave it to their father. And there's no present that creates this longevity of memory of the person who gave it, like vintage port.
Excellent. I've got that one well written down for the next time I'm writing about why we should all buy more vintage port. Robert, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, my children all have their wine in the cellar. So my daughter knocks on the case of on the pile of vintages that are hers. Not yours, Daddy. They're mine.
Love it.
Very, very well trained.
Very good.
Should we go on the next slide?
Let's do it.
So the next style, I would say, pick up both glasses together, and just swirl them around, and you can see that on color, they're very different. So the 10-year-old, it's got that light brick red color, and then if you look at the 20-year-old, it's starting to take more of an amber color. Now, first off, if your 20 has the color of a 10, that's a question mark, because you want to use vintage quality to go into your aged tawnies. So if you don't use a real big quality wine, it'll lose color and strip flavor far too fast. So if a 10-year-old looks like a 20, you probably, either it could have been cooked in travel, but it could be that the raw materials are not what they should be. Oxidative maturation is quite an aggressive way to mature your wine, and so you need to have vintage quality to be able to put it into the pipe and to age 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but also have the acidity and tannins to balance the sugar that will be increasing. So here we're probably around 105 grams per liter. So here, yes, you definitely get this sort of that sort of fig jam, dried fig flavors. Got good acidity, and that's the most important thing. With any sweet wine that doesn't have that acidity and structure, for me it's nice, but you can do better. You need to have that balance with that sugar, and this with an apple pie or a pear tart is absolutely delicious. Actually, in the summer months, these two wines are the only ones you can slightly chill, because they're concentrated wines, so to have 2.5% evaporation every year, and so being concentrated, they can still punch through at a lower temperature. Now, you get this one, because it's concentrated, you also get that wonderful length. And actually, this style of wine is where we're seeing the most amount of growth, the greatest popularity around the world, which it does create a little bit of a problem, because it therefore forces you to have a lot of stocks. Because when you have to have a 10 and a 20, you do need to have a lot of stocks, so that every time you have a Taylor's 10 or a Taylor 20, it tastes the same. If you don't have the stocks in the cellar, you'll make a good blend one year, but then the next year it's completely different, and you have huge inconsistencies in quality and house style. And so this is why we try not to make table wine, because we want all of our top quality grapes to go into port wine, and so we can make a lot of high quality wines going to make vintage and into our aged tawny program. And I think this is where we're a little bit different, is I think we're probably the last who have not gone into table wine production because we're focusing so much in this category. Now go into the 20 straight afterwards. Again, that lovely grip of Taylor's. You're not getting so much the thickness, you're getting more the walnuts, hazelnuts, you're getting those more apricot flavors, dried apricot flavors coming through. And the good thing about this, Liz, is that if you look at your 20-year-old whiskies and look at the price of this, it's actually very affordable. I think this is why a lot of people, I think, are moving out of the whiskey category and going to this to relax in the evening. They're probably still having a whiskey in the evening on a weekend, but during the week, every other day, they're probably having a 20-year-old and then going back to the whiskeys sort of with their mates at the bar. But this is why I think the 20 is doing so well around the world.
Yeah, so I think, Robert, also comparatively, you know, if you look at our prices on the 10 and the 20, you may as well have the 20.
This is what everyone's worked out around the world. You know, it's a very, very good glass just to sit and relax. It's got beautiful complexity here, and this with a creme brulee, anything with vanilla, walnuts, caramelized sugar flavors in your dessert will go absolutely perfectly with a 20-year-old. Now, I mean, this is to be good at a 10 and a 20, you do have to be a little bit nuts. You do have to be probably a family business, because the costs of doing 10s and 20s is enormous because of the stocks. You know, to make table wine is great. I mean, I wish we did, because you grow your grapes and within a year and a half, 2 years, you've sold it, and your bank manager's happy. You know, we're so crazy. We make our wine and we shove it into a pipe and we don't sell it for 20 years. So, you know, that has a huge weight on the company. To give you an idea of what we have in stock, we probably have about 43.5 million liters of port aging. So think of that as 17 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of port wine. Now, I know, Liz, you're thinking, where can you go to swim in that? But it's a huge investment. But this means that we are not only able to create a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old, a single harvest 68, 69 available for the market, but it means that the quality will be the same every year. So you trust us to make this style the same every year. And also, if there's an increase in demand from maybe India or China or New Zealand, we have the stocks that are available, so in 20 years' time, so we can maintain the quality of our port.
Robert, thank you. A question on the 10 and 20. In terms of once you've opened them, and not something I can answer because I tend to find they don't stay in the bottle when I open them. But
I have the same problem.
Yeah, it's been a family one for a while. But should there be port left in the bottle, how long before it loses the freshness, or how long? What's the shelf life?
Okay, so I've got some bottles in front of me. So, if you can see, so that is the T-top that you can all see that. That's the T-top that comes out of a non-vintage port. So anything that has a T-top is designed to be consumed over, I I mean, 4 to 6 weeks. An aged tawny can probably do 8 weeks, but if it's taking you 8 weeks to drink a 20-year-old, you really need a bigger glass. And then after that, it probably will lose its freshness. It loses freshness. It won't be bad, but you just bought a wonderful bottle of wine. Why not drink it a little bit earlier? Anything that has a driven cork that you find in table wines, some table wines, and now everyone's going through to other closures, but that will be vintage port. Now, vintage port has never really seen oxygen. So when you pull the cork on a vintage port, it will react to oxygen. And so you really want to drink a vintage port. If it's got some age to it, you want to drink it really within a sitting, maybe the following day. If it's a young vintage port, you can probably do it over a week. But in general, I think the plan is, with vintage port, get a few good friends round, pull the cork and drink it in that sitting. But
Excellent.
for 20-year-old, think 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. Okay, but it shouldn't take you that long.
No. 2 more questions for you. The first one is just, can you explain the difference between Ruby and Tawny? So we've got Tawny ports here. Why are they Tawny port?
So just to be accurate, so there's also a product called Ruby and Tawny. They're both 2 to 3 year old wines. Those are still quite young, so they're still quite fruity. So a basic Ruby will have a lot of freshness of fruit, very similar to the first estate, but it won't have as much intensity as the first estate. The Tawny will come across as having a little bit more, it'll have some nutty nuances to it, but it'll have more of the dried fruit characteristics. It'll have a little bit more prune flavors coming through on the basic Tawny. The 10 and the 20, the 30, 40, those are all wines that have gone into pipes, the smaller barrels that are 600 liters. And so they've had more interaction with oxygen, and they've lost a lot of their fruit, or almost all of their fruit, and picked up the nutty characteristics. So I say the aged Tawnies are the nutty ones, and the Rubies are the fruity ones.
Lovely.
And I think that's the best way, actually, in a wine store, is to separate. This side is fruity, that side is nutty, because some people don't like nutty ports. They want fruity ports. So it just helps them to say, look, this is where you'll find all the fruity ports.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is, can you tell us about the aging of your wines and any special features of your warehouses?
I didn't hear you.
Sorry, the aging conditions in your warehouses. So any special features? Are they modern? Are they traditional?
So did you say warehouses for aging?
So where do you store the port, and what are the conditions? Would sum it up, I think.
Yeah, sorry. Historically, we aged the ports here in Villeneuve de Gaia, across on the south side of the Porto, the Douro River. However, due to legislation that came out in the early 2000s, a lot of the port producers have been pushed out of there. A lot of their aging facilities have moved out. And so we are now storing more of our wine actually here in our new office location in Gaia, but a lot of it is actually in the Douro Valley. And historically, we could never do that because of technology, because a lot of the Douro Tawnies, and we sometimes get offered some aged Tawnies from the Douro, they've been stored next to the river. It's too hot. And you try these aged Tawnies, and they have what we call Douro bake, and which is kind of like they're very flat, they're not very vibrant, and they almost have like a banana flambé, sort of cooked banana flavor to them. So the Douro, the problem is heat, and how we address the problem of heat is we found a mountain location to build a warehouse. So we've addressed the heat problem. It does also have a heat shield over it as well. But when you go on a mountain, you create another problem. It's drier. So then your evaporation goes through the roof. Now, the angels are very happy with that. However, we weren't. So what you do is you put humidifiers in. And so we're able to control the humidity of the warehouse, and that allows us to manage the amount of evaporation that we're getting in our cellar. So more often now, the wines will stay in the Douro in this location, and when we need it, the wines will be brought down to Villanova de Gaia to be blended and prepared. So this reduces the amount of movement that the wines will have, because historically there's way too much movement in your stocks. So our stocks have less movement. And when we need them, we bring them down, we bottle it and put it into the market. All except for vintage, which spends one winter in the Douro and then comes down to our facilities here. And then it stays there untouched until it's ready for blending the following year.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think interesting lineup, the way we've put it together tonight, Robert. I think, you know, starting with the white and going through that wonderful flight of vintage, and then to finish on these tawnies. I think it's been really interesting to show the different faces and different voices of port. So really fascinating tasting, thank you. And before we just finish, wanted to just introduce everyone on the call to Jack. I know Jack has drunk a lot of port, and in fact I think, Jack, we've enjoyed some old Taylor's vintage out of your cellar, I do believe. And Jack's probably really enjoying this tonight, because if he holds up his left hand, I think we can we can see that he's had a wee operation yesterday. But Jack, thought you might like to just comment on the ports and say hello.
Yes, I'd love to, and firstly, Robert, it's been really great.
Jack.
Hi.
Cheers, good to see you.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to meet you online, and thanks for joining our series, which has been very popular. And thank you for those and thank you for those that have joined tonight, because, you know, without you guys, we wouldn't be who we are. Robert, I enjoyed your sense of humor and your little jokes on the side. Excellent, but wonderful ports. And I'll just make a few comments from my perspective. Firstly, white ports have seen a rejuvenation here in New Zealand, probably solely from one individual who's sitting over there up the top there, Liz, who loves her white port and tonic. For those that are listening, substitute it for your gin and tonic, because I feel that it's a wonderful alternative. Okay, it's not the same aromatic taste, but it gives you that same lifted, summery feeling. It's fun, and it's a great start for a tasting. So I really enjoyed that, and I've introduced my wife to it, who's downstairs making an apple and rhubarb crumble. I can smell it.
Right.
I really enjoyed that.
10-year-old.
Yeah. But briefly across these wonderful wines, the 94 had a certain oily, aromatic, Australian eucalyptusy oiliness coming through it, which I thought was shown. You talked about the spirit, and obviously I know my spirits well, and it showed maybe the roughness of the spirit, but it's hitting its straps. I really enjoyed that. However, the 07 was absolutely stunning. I really enjoyed that. Probably my favorite tonight, mainly because it's at its best. It's definitely at one of its prime level in its evolution. I really enjoyed the way it's got lots of structure and complexity and flavors. While the third one in the vintage lineup, the 16, wow, I think we just have to wait and see. That's a little sleeping giant. I can see it just creeping up there.
I mean, the 16 is, it is a sleeping giant, but I think what caused the concentration in the 16 is the fact that we lost a lot of our fruit in the beginning of the harvest. So we had a wonderful growing season, but very few grapes. And so all of that, all that sunlight was just being concentrated in very few grapes. So I think that's probably the lowest production we've ever had in the history of our company in the 16.
Yeah.
So it's a very rare wine. The 7 is, it's delicious now. It's the 7 was a little bit cooler, so you get this freshness of fruit that you don't really get. Where the 2009 being a little bit hotter, you get a little bit more opulent, completely different. And that's what I love about vintage port. They're different. You can still discover so many things with all the vintage ports.
Yes, no, it was wonderful. And then to finish with the 10 and 20 was a nice little finale. And I agree with Liz. Why would you buy the 10 when you've got that lovely 20, which obviously, for me, the complexity, the balance, it's drinking well now, etc. But I really enjoyed the 10. In fact, that's what's in my little barrel. Tucked to the side. I've got my own little port barrel, about that big. Never got much in it, but it's nice to be able to just pour a little bit out, So really enjoyed this tasting, and the knowledge as well. We loved your little snippets about the vinification and all the different the co-fermentation, and those things have been really, really knowledgeable. So it's all added together to be a wonderful tasting, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing yourself come down here to New Zealand one day and to meet you in person and show you around. And Robin, I've got a couple of 77s tucked away. I might have to put Robert's name on one. So
no, please do. I'll be there like a shot.
I will do, but you got to come and drink it with us. Okay.
No. As soon as we get our jabs, I'll be over, and I'm sure my wife, who was in the trade, will probably be joining me. So she's very good at helping me polish off a vintage port.
Very good. So thank you again. And well, we're trapped down here in Aotearoa in the bottom of the South Pacific. Pretty much, our waters are now open, but we're not going anywhere for a little while. I'm dying to get back. I will get up to Scotland, but we'll see how we go. So all the best, and I hope you guys are healthy and safe. Stay put. Don't rush around the world yet. Just send us lots of support.
Okay, no, I'm absolutely fine with that, and and everyone stay in good health. And if we don't hear from anyone, have a wonderful Christmas that's coming up with maybe a chilled glass of 20-year-old.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Great to meet you online.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Excellent tasting, and thank you very much to everyone that joined us. As per usual, we will send out an email tomorrow morning, which will have a link to a tasting if you want to come back and revisit anything. We'll also send you out a link to all of the wines online, and there will be a special offer for you tomorrow in that email. So that'll come out tomorrow morning, and suggest you wait for that. There'll also be a little offer around East Imperial so that you can enjoy more white port and tonic. It's going to be, from the look of it, a very nice long weekend that we have ahead. So thank you all again, and thank you, Robert, very much for taking us through the ports. Excellent tasting.
And Liz, thank you very much, and thank you everybody. And you've all proved today that port wine for breakfast is absolutely amazing, and I'm sure the rest of the day is going to go swimmingly.
I noticed you weren't spitting.
Well, it was early. I forgot the spittoon.
Good excuse.
Have a great day.
Have a great day,
everyone.
Thanks,
Robert.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Jack.